Imagine for a second that you are looking at a historical map of the world, but there is a giant 500-year wide hole ripped right out of the middle of it.
Just a massive, gaping, blank space.
Right. Just completely blank. And you'd probably assume some cataclysmic event happened, right? Like a period where human progress just entirely stopped and everyone forgot how to think.
Like a global reset button.
Exactly. Well, when it comes to the way modern economics is usually taught, that ripped up map is unfortunately exactly what you get. You're looking at a 500-year wide intellectual black hole.
Which is pretty crazy when you actually dig into it.
It really is. So today, we are diving into the exact sources that fill that gap. We have a fascinating stack of academic papers outlining the foundational session of the History of Islamic Economic Thought course.
A really dense but super fascinating stack of papers.
Oh, definitely. And our mission today is to explore a massive, sophisticated heritage that mainstream history has, well, for a very long time, completely ignored.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand why this map is missing a piece in the first place, we had to talk about one of the most famous economists of the 20th century.
Right. Joseph Schumpeter.
Yeah, Joseph Schumpeter. He wrote this massively influential book back in 1954 called The History of Economic Analysis, and he basically, well, he created this academic void all by himself.
He really did codify that blind spot for the modern era. I mean,
Yeah.
Schumpeter put forward what became known as the Great Gap thesis.
The Great Gap.
Yeah. He argued that if you are studying the history of economic thinking, you can safely leap from the ancient Greeks, jump over 5 entire centuries of history, and land straight in the lap of the European scholastics.
Like St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century.
Precisely. He just wrote off half a millennium. He basically suggested that from roughly 700 to 1200 AD, absolutely nothing of relevance to economics was written, debated, or theorized. I mean, 500 years of human civilization just glossed over as a rounding error? That is wild.
That's huge oversight.
But what was actually happening in the world during that time? Because while Europe was going through what we historically call the Dark Ages, the rest of the globe wasn't just, sitting around in the mud.
Far from it. What's fascinating here is that while Western Europe was highly decentralized and, quite frankly, economically fragmented during that period, an incredibly active Islamic empire was experiencing a true golden age.
We are talking about a massive footprint, right?
Huge. A connected civilization stretching all the way from Andalusia in modern-day Spain, across North Africa, through the Middle East, and all the way to the borders of China.
Wow.
And they weren't just holding territory. They were driving a massive economic, scientific, and intellectual fluorescence.
Okay, let me stop you there, because conquering a massive territory is one thing, but running a transcontinental empire requires serious financial plumbing.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you don't manage a trade network from Spain to China with just a barter system and a few random coins. What did the actual mechanics of their economy look like?
Well, it was heavily institutionalized. To manage that sheer scale of wealth and public works, they developed centralized financial institutions, like the Baitul Mal.
The Baitul Mal. What is that exactly?
It was functioned as a state treasury, but it was highly structured. We're talking strict accounting standards to manage public revenues, taxation, and welfare expenditures.
So a proper, formal government treasury.
Exactly. And to lubricate trade across all those different borders, they instituted a bimetallic currency system. They used the dinar, which was a gold coin, and a dirham, a silver coin.
Wait, why use both? Doesn't having two currencies just, I don't know, complicate things for merchants?
You'd think so, but it actually solves a massive logistical problem.
How so?
Well, different regions have different natural resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
A silver-rich region and a gold-rich region can trade seamlessly if there's a widely accepted standardized exchange rate between the two metals.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it provided a reliable medium of exchange. It meant a merchant in North Africa could price goods for a buyer in Persia without constantly worrying about local currency fluctuations.
But hold on, if I'm moving high-value goods like, say, silk or spices from Persia to Cairo, carrying literal sacks of gold dinars sounds like a logistical nightmare.
A very heavy, very dangerous nightmare.
You'd basically be a walking target for bandits. How did they solve the physical security problem without, a modern electronic banking grid?
That is where they engineered advanced credit instruments. One of the most brilliant innovations, which originated in Persia and was adapted heavily by Muslim jurists, was the suftajah.
The suftajah. Okay, how did that actually work in practice?
Think of it as an early bill of exchange or a highly secure letter of credit. Let's say a merchant wants to travel. They could deposit physical gold with a trusted financial agent in one city, say Baghdad. In return, they don't take the gold. They receive a certified paper document. The merchant travels light, completely safe from highway robbery, gets to Cairo, presents that document to the agent's partner network there, and cashes it out for local currency.
Okay, I have to push back on that a bit. Without computers, without the internet, how does a guy in Cairo verify that a piece of paper from Baghdad is actually legitimate?
Right, the fraud question.
Yeah. What prevented someone from just forging these papers?
It all came down to trust networks and severe reputational economics. These financial agents belong to interconnected merchant families and guilds with incredibly dense communication networks.
So everyone knew everyone.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they used physical wax seals, coded language, and complex bookkeeping. But the real deterrent was reputation. If an agent defaulted or committed fraud, they were entirely cut out of the transcontinental trade system.
Which meant total financial ruin.
Exactly. And the Muslim scholars and jurists regulated these instruments rigorously to ensure they facilitated trade without violating Sharia laws against usury or interest.
So they have this functioning, massive economic engine. They have state treasuries, stable money, and international credit networks running on trust and early cryptography.
It's remarkably sophisticated.
But Schumpeter and conventional economists argue that practical success doesn't necessarily equal theoretical genius. Like, building a treasury is one thing, writing economic theory is another.
That's the classic critique, yeah.
Did they actually have the intellectual frameworks to back this up, or were they just copying older civilizations to keep the lights on?
That question actually highlights the biggest myth about medieval Muslim scholars, the assumption that they were merely acting as custodians of older knowledge.
The Eurocentric narrative paints them as just librarians.
Yes, exactly, the librarian myth.
The story goes that they just kept Greek philosophy, like Aristotle, warm. They photocopied it, put it on a shelf, and held on to it until Europe finally woke up and asked for it back.
And that narrative completely ignores the reality of the translation period, which spanned roughly the 8th to the 11th centuries.
What were they actually doing during that time then?
Well, yes, translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts was a massive state-sponsored enterprise at places like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. But they didn't just passively ingest these texts.
They weren't just transcribing.
Not at all. They aggressively critiqued the Greeks. They actively found flaws in Aristotle's logic. More importantly, they synthesized Greek philosophical logic with their own empirical observations of their booming trade economy, and they grounded all of it in Islamic Sharia ethics.
So if I'm understanding this right, it's kind of like medicine. Think of economic science as a medical thermometer.
Okay, like this.
The thermometer just gives you objective data, right? It tells you a patient has 102-degree fever. Greek logic provided some of those thermometers, the analytical tools.
Right.
But economic thought is the doctor deciding what to do with that data based on the ethical goal of preserving human life. The Muslim scholars took the analytical thermometers, but they didn't copy the Greek goals. They acted as the doctors, making their own moral medical decisions based on social justice and human dignity.
That is a perfect framework for understanding their contribution. They separated the objective tools of economic activity from the philosophical motivations guiding it. You see this vividly in the work of scholars like Al-Ghazali in the 11th century.
Al-Ghazali, what was his main focus?
Well, long before the European Enlightenment, long before Adam Smith was even born, Al-Ghazali was writing detailed conceptualizations of how markets evolve organically from human needs.
Really? What specifically was he observing?
He was analyzing the necessity of specialization and the division of labor. He wrote extensively about the double coincidence of wants.
Which is the fatal flaw of a barter system, right?
Exactly. If I have a massive pile of onions and I desperately want a camel, I have to somehow find a camel owner who specifically wants a massive pile of onions at that exact moment.
Which is almost impossible.
Right. So Al-Ghazali theorized how society naturally adopts money, not because the metal itself has inherent use, but as a universally accepted medium of exchange to solve that exact friction.
He was applying deep theoretical analysis to market mechanics.
Yes. He wasn't just managing the treasury. He was theorizing why money functions the way it does.
Well, wait, if Al-Ghazali is writing foundational economic theory in the 11th century, how did it end up shaping Western economics? Like, how did Europe eventually get hold of these ideas if the West, like Schumpeter, didn't even acknowledge them?
It required a massive phase of transmission spanning the 12th to the 15th centuries. These synthesized ideas moved from the Islamic world to Europe, through a few major conduits.
The Crusades being one of them, I assume.
Yes, the Crusades forced violent but significant cultural contact. Then there were the Mediterranean trade routes, which meant merchants were constantly exchanging not just goods, but commercial contracts and legal concepts.
Ideas travel with money.
Always. But the most significant intellectual bridges were Islamic Andalusia, modern Spain and Sicily.
Because those were places where cultures were basically living on top of each other for centuries.
Precisely. In these border regions, a massive reverse translation effort began. They started turning Arabic works and the Arabic commentaries on the Greeks into Latin. And this is the direct connection to the European scholastics.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Right, because St. Thomas Aquinas, the very figure Schumpeter credits with restarting economic thought after the Great Gap, was deeply indebted to this Arabic literature.
So Aquinas was reading Al-Ghazali.
Oh, absolutely. Aquinas' foundational work, the Summa Theologica, heavily mirrored the methodological frameworks laid down by Al-Ghazali.
In what way?
Well, where Al-Ghazali used analytical reasoning to synthesize Greek logic with Islamic theology, Aquinas used that exact same intellectual blueprint to reconcile Aristotle with Christian theology. The European scholastics derived their intellectual armory from Muslim philosophers like Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd.
But wait, if Aquinas and the scholastics are using these frameworks, why didn't they just cite their sources?
Yeah.
They absorbed the concepts, adapted the frameworks, but effectively buried the legacy. I mean, you can't see the bridge if someone painted over it.
Well, we have to consider the political and religious climate of the time.
Which was incredibly tense.
Exactly. Europe was in the midst of the Crusades and the Reconquista in Spain. Acknowledging that the foundational logic for Christian theology was heavily adapted from Muslim jurists was, well, it was politically and religiously unpalatable.
It would have been a PR disaster for them.
A total disaster. So the transmission happened often orally or through translated commentaries, but the originators were scrubbed from the final European texts. Over centuries of cultural assimilation, the original Muslim authorship was forgotten.
Creating the illusion of Schumpeter's Great Gap.
Exactly. The gap wasn't an absence of thought, it was an erasure of authorship.
Okay, so now that we know how these ideas reached the modern world and got buried, we need to look at what those core philosophies actually were. Because the foundation of Islamic economic thought fundamentally clashes with the economics you and I are taught today.
Oh, fundamentally, it's a completely different worldview.
Let's establish the baseline first. The conventional Western paradigm we live under is built on Homo economicus, the rational economic man.
Right, the absolute foundation of modern microeconomics.
Homo economicus dictates that humans are purely secular, rational actors. We are driven entirely by self-interest, and our only goal is to maximize our mathematical utility and profit.
The equation is simple. More is always better.
Right. But in stark contrast, the historical sources we are looking at outline the paradigm of Homo Islamicus.
Yes, Homo Islamicus. This is a consumer or producer who is guided by Maqasid Sharia, which are the foundational objectives of Islamic law.
And what are those objectives, roughly?
They prioritize the preservation of 5 things: life, intellect, lineage, property, and religion.
How does that actually change the decision-making process on a Tuesday when you're doing business, like practically speaking?
It changes your time horizon and your ultimate goal. Homo Islamicus balances secular utility, the material needs of this life, with ritual utility, or the life after. And it introduces a foundational concept called ownership by trusteeship.
Ownership by trusteeship. That implies you don't actually own your own stuff.
In a philosophical sense, you don't. In this paradigm, humans are not the absolute owners of the Earth's resources. They are vice barons or trustees appointed to manage resources that ultimately belong to the divine.
Wow, so it completely changes your relationship to capital.
Exactly. If you are managing a trust, your goal cannot be the blind, ruthless maximization of profit at the expense of everything else. Your mandate is moderation, upholding human dignity and ensuring the long-term survival of the society.
I want you, the listener, to consider your own financial decisions for a moment. When you make a choice, whether it's an investment, a purchase, or how you run a business, are you optimizing purely for your bank account?
Are you acting as Homo economicus?
Right. Or are you optimizing for your community, your ethical footprint, and a sense of long-term stewardship like Homo Islamicus? It completely reframes the very definition of success.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a system driven purely by maximization inherently conflicts with a system driven by moderation. Maximization pushes limits to the breaking point, whereas moderation builds in social safety nets and boundaries.
Okay, in theory, that sounds highly ethical, but let's be real here. Economics is fundamentally the study of scarcity. We have limited resources and unlimited wants. How does an ethics-first philosophy handle the brutal math of a lack of resources?
It approaches the math from the exact opposite direction. Conventional economics obsesses over absolute scarcity.
Right.
The assumption is that because resources are limited, the only way to solve the problem is through endless, relentless production. The focus is almost entirely on the supply side.
Oh.
Just keep making more stuff to satisfy infinite desires.
Grow the GDP at all costs.
Exactly. But the Islamic approach heavily intervenes on the demand side.
Wait, the demand side?
Yes. While it certainly encourages development and production, it actively manages what people want, or at least what they are culturally and legally allowed to relentlessly pursue. It curtails artificial scarcity by regulating human behavior through two vital, nuanced concepts, israf and tabdir.
Okay, let's break those down because the distinction between them is incredibly sharp in these sources.
It is. So israf translates roughly to extravagance or overextension. It refers to extending your consumption well beyond your basic needs into excessive luxury.
Like buying a massive mansion for 3 people when a modest house would suffice?
Exactly. It is discouraged because it diverts resources away from the community, but legally speaking, it is not considered the absolute worst offense.
So israf is buying a 3rd sports car when the sedan in the driveway works just fine. What's the worst offense then?
The worst offense is tabdir. This means wastage. And it refers to the unnecessary, frivolous destruction of economic resources, even when you are fulfilling a basic, legitimate need.
Wait, if I'm buying something essential, how can I be committing tabdir?
The historical texts give a really brilliant example of this. Imagine a tailor making a modest, basic suit of clothes.
Okay, fulfilling the need for clothing, which is essential.
Right. But if that tailor recklessly cuts the cloth, destroying excess fabric that could have easily been used by someone else, that is tabdir. You are fulfilling a need, but you are destroying utility in the process. Tabdir is strictly forbidden. It is morally penalized.
It's funny you mention the tailor because the modern equivalent is basically fast fashion, right?
Oh, 100%.
Buying a shirt for $5 that falls apart in a week and goes straight to a landfill, or buying $400 designer jeans that come pre-destroyed and ripped from the factory. You are actively paying to destroy utility.
That is a perfect modern parallel. You are squandering resources that others could utilize, which violates the concept of trusteeship.
But let me challenge this. Applying a 12th century ethical framework to today's hyper-globalized, chaotic economy feels, I don't know, a bit like wishful thinking. We are dealing with massive inflation, algorithmic price gouging, and terrible housing crises. Does a concept like tabdir or demand-side intervention actually hold any water against modern capitalism?
It actually has profound architectural relevance today. Think about demand-pull inflation, where too many dollars are chasing too few goods, driving prices through the roof.
We've definitely seen a lot of that recently.
Right. Well, by culturally prohibiting israf, unchecked extravagance, this framework inherently cools down that artificial demand. If society isn't relentlessly pursuing luxury at all costs, the artificial demand stabilizes.
And I imagine it affects the supply side during a crisis, too.
Absolutely. The hoarding of wealth or essential goods is entirely incompatible with ownership by trusteeship.
Because you don't really own it anyway.
Exactly. If you were just managing resources for the greater good, hoarding real estate to artificially drive up rents, or price gouging medical supplies during a pandemic is a direct moral breach of that trust. The system inherently outlaws the very behaviors that manufacture modern economic crises.
So it acts as a built-in economic cooling system. That's fascinating, but that raises a massive historical question for me.
Go ahead.
If this system was so robust, so advanced that it laid the groundwork for Europe, why isn't the Islamic Empire still the dominant economic force today? Like, what actually happened?
To map the historical trajectory honestly, we do have to look at the decline. Following the Golden Age and the transmission of these ideas to Europe, the Islamic intellectual engine eventually fell into a prolonged period of stagnation.
Why did they stagnate?
The sources attribute this largely to a phenomenon called taqlid. Yes, which translates to blind imitation.
Ah, so they stopped being the doctor and started just reading old prescriptions.
That is exactly what happened. The dynamic, critical thinking that characterized scholars like Al-Ghazali, the willingness to debate and synthesize new empirical data, was replaced by a rigid adherence to past rulings.
So legal and economic innovation just stalled out.
It stalled completely. And because their institutions stopped adapting to new realities, the empire became economically and politically vulnerable. This internal stagnation ultimately paved the way for European colonialism.
The same Europe that had borrowed their foundational ideas centuries earlier arrives to colonize them. The irony there is pretty dark.
The historical irony is incredibly stark.
Yeah.
However, the shock of colonialism and the subsequent post-colonial struggles of the 19th and 20th centuries served as a massive wake-up call.
It forced them to look in the mirror.
Exactly. It sparked a modern revival. Thinkers realized they couldn't just rely on Taqlid anymore. There was a massive movement to rediscover those foundational principles, the Maqasid Sharia, the balance of supply and demand, the ethics of trusteeship, and figure out how to apply them to modern banking.
And that revival is exactly what led to the birth of the multi-trillion-dollar modern Islamic finance industry we see today.
Spot on. It was a rediscovery of their own roots.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a torn-up map staring at Schumpeter's 500-year gap. And what we found wasn't a void at all.
And not even close.
It was a vibrant, centuries-long intellectual bridge. Medieval Muslim scholars didn't just babysit group texts. They diagnosed the economic realities of a transcontinental empire. They synthesized a holistic worldview that balanced the cold mechanics of the market with human dignity and ethical stewardship. And in doing so, they provided the intellectual scaffolding for the European Renaissance.
It really forces us to completely reevaluate the lineage of modern thought. But more importantly, it raises an urgent question for us right now.
What's that?
Well, we live in an age where the digital economy and the algorithms governing our screens are explicitly designed to optimize our consumption. They are engineered to turn us into the ultimate, unrestrained Homo economicus.
Just clicking buy now over and over?
Exactly. But what would happen to our fractured global supply chains or our mounting climate crisis if we reprogrammed those digital economies to recognize tabdir? What if our systems were designed to mathematically penalize waste instead of just rewarding endless, relentless scale?
Wow, that is a paradigm shift we might desperately need to survive the next century. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the maps you've been handed. You never know what history has been hiding in the blank spaces.